Welcome everybody. Today we're going to be talking about psychiatric diagnosis. We're going to be covering a little bit of the history of the DSM, but I went in depth into that topic in my latest blog post. I'll link it down below. We'll be referencing the DSM a lot in this video because, of course, the DSM is largely at fault for demonizing mental illness in a way, creating this notion that mental illness is some sort of brain defect or abnormality. And to be blunt, mental illness is adaptation. It is not pathology. Just like all disease is adaptation. Every symptom in our body is our body trying to heal itself. The same goes for mental health. We're going to focus a little bit more in on that right now. And by the end of this video, hopefully you understand how the DSM sort of shaped this view, even though there's really no evidence to support it anymore. And they admit that there's really no evidence to support this. I hope you guys enjoy the video. So, psychiatric illnesses have been around for a long time. I'm covered in black flies here right now. That's all right. So if you see me swatting, don't worry about it. Psychiatric diagnosis really has been around for a long time. You know, even in antiquity, they had reference to mental illness. You know, Hippocrates and Galen spoke of mental illness. You know, melancholy or, you know, even psychosis was talked about quite a lot. So it's not necessarily a new phenomenon. And so, you know, through antiquity, these practitioners like Galen and Hippocrates, they pushed, well, Hippocrates mostly pushed the notion of the humors being out of balance causing some sort of mental illness. Galen didn't reject this, but he also added that it can be environmental and it can have psychological causes as well. Things like psychological traumas, even physical traumas could lead to some psychological things. It's a little bit nuanced, but you know, the concept has been around for a very long time. And so you had that sort of Greek philosopher concept of mental illness. And the Stoics talked a lot about mental well-being too, right? And they realized that, you know, it was through responsibility largely that the healing and the growth occurred, which I think is an important thing that we always explore here. Responsibility is absolutely fundamental. You know, taking the utmost responsibility for all of your actions and anything that happens in your life is the best way to live, in my opinion, because you'll never succumb to any sort of victim mindset, which leads to a more closed mindset. But you know, so you had that, and then you also had the church that was pushing this sort of demonic cause, you know, sin or whatever it was, right? You were sort of plagued by the devil, and that's what was causing these psychosis. Not necessarily an absurd thought, right, when you experience people who are undergoing these sort of conditions. And not much really happened in the history of mental health from that time all the way until, you know, the 1800s. Humors were still accepted as the leading cause of mental health up until that time, pretty much up until psychoanalysis took over. You know, obviously it was either the humors or it was demons, and so those two schools of thought sort of butt head throughout all of history up until this psychoanalytic phase of psychiatry and psychology. So they were trying to blame this underlying cause. You know, there must be something wrong with the individual, which is leading them to be this way, right? Good boy. Good boy. And then came along the likes of Freud and the other psychoanalysts. And again, they all had their sort of specific underlying causes of mental health condition. It seemed to be more environmental within psychoanalysis. Freud definitely looked at the biological realm, of course, and sort of equated, you know, a lot of problems within individuals to their relationships within their families. And, you know, he's half right. And that's an important thing, and we'll go over that more. We'll go over a lot of the psychoanalytic schools of thought in the future. Analysts really took over psychology, and the way they approached it was largely environmental, right? They were trying to change the adaptability of the individual and change the individual's environment. And you can see how this progresses now. So, you know, say you're stuck working this dead-end job, but you need to work the job to make ends meet. You know, obviously it would be best if you could change your environment and follow your dreams and do what you love and what you're passionate about. But that's not always possible. So sometimes you need to look at yourself and say, how am I going to build resilience, right? You need to first accept the situation wholly as it is, and then sort of move forward and try and build some resilience. In the late 1800s, there was only one classification for mental health, and that was idiocy and insanity, both used interchangeably. And this increased over time where like melancholy got added, like depression and bipolar mania, things of this nature. Psychological nosology has increased from one classification for mental health conditions to now having hundreds of different classes and subclasses. So how did this happen? So the American Medico-Psychological Association did release this sort of psychological disorder classification system. And, you know, there were a few cases in here and there. They were trying to create some sort of standardized diagnostic manual. And the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health, the DSM, was truly the most renowned version of this. And so we begin with the DSM-1. So DSM-1 and 2 I can talk about similarly, because although the number of mental health conditions increased significantly from the first one to the second one, the underlying philosophy of DSM-1 and 2 were largely psychoanalytic. And these texts are very subjective. To sort of diagnose somebody was a very subjective endeavor. And so things really changed with DSM-3. What we started to see was this underlying brain pathology philosophy of mental health, and that these diagnoses were diagnoses of diseases. We were beginning to treat these mental health conditions as any other condition, right? Because psychiatry was really on the rise. Mental health conditions are common and they are treatable. That was the major notion that, you know, the pharmaceutical companies were pushing. And, you know, everybody wanted to sort of push this notion that they're treatable. Of course, you can cure mental health conditions. You know, pharmaceutical companies want to tell you that you can take this pill and cure your mental health condition. Psychoanalysts will say that you need to go under, you know, strict analysis for 3 years, and then we'll cure your underlying conditions for your mental health condition. And of course, there are things you can do, and there are practitioners out there that can help you get over mental health conditions. But if they're not working with your environment, with your support systems, with your goals and dreams and things of this nature, then they're not the right practitioner. But I digress. We saw this changing nature of diagnosis with DSM-3. Now, DSM-3 and 4 were atheoretical. And so essentially this means that there's no underlying theory that sort of wrote the book. And this was actually really important. Still, diagnosis has a problem because we're still looking at individuals with these diagnoses as being abnormal, as having a dysfunction. But there was certainly less dogma riddled throughout the DSM-3 and 4 than there were in all other editions. So 3 and 4 were largely atheoretical. Now, the real problems with psychiatry were coming from the pharmaceutical efforts that was kind of behind the scenes in DSM. And to be honest, I think that this was the long game, right? Because they were trying to push the notion of diagnosis without having actual implications in the books themselves to sort of gain the trust, because largely psychiatry was trying to medicalize itself, right? It was not accepted in medicine. Psychiatry was seen as this sort of pseudoscience whack shit. And so the DSM-3 did sort of medicalize mental health, as there's a diagnosis for each condition and there are classification systems. But where this really went bad and sort of solidified it was the DSM-5. And we see the return of a theoretical framework. The DSM-5 is completely based in neurology, in imbalances of the brain and things of this nature, right? There is the neurochemical theory of the brain, not necessarily imbalance, but that prevails throughout the DSM-5. With the DSM-5 really comes along this medical model of mental health. And the DSM-5 text itself is likely the worst text ever written in the history of medicine, in my opinion. If you're going to use a diagnostic manual, it should be the DSM-3 or 4. They are much better than the DSM-5 and the DSM-1 and 2. Still, I think diagnosis places labels on people that are problematic, but we'll talk about that more in upcoming videos. And that extends to more than just mental health. That extends to all disease. Diagnoses are problematic. So now we have the DSM-5 centered around this neurological model of the brain, that there's underlying brain pathology to all mental health conditions, and it negates environmental factors. It admittedly negates psychosocial factors, environmental factors, other mental health conditions, other medical conditions, and things of this nature. One of the things about the DSM-3 and 4 was this multi-axial system where you sort of assessed these factors. You looked at the individual. You didn't just look for a diagnosis. Now, of course, we have this model within medicine in which it's a treatment for diagnosis. You know, quick 15-minute appointments can get you diagnosed. They can get your prescription and you're supposed to feel better. Diagnostic and statistical manuals and history in general has always demonized mental illness. But these are symptoms. These are symptoms of an underlying condition, an underlying cause. Everything stems from the terrain. Everything stems from the environment that you're in. You know, we are environmental beings. Our genes adapt to our environments. Our brains adapt to our environments. The psychologist, the counselor, the therapist needs to be addressing the environment and needs to be addressing the individual as a whole. We can't be looking at specific conditions. We can't be looking at specific diseases or disorders. We need to be looking at the individual as a whole and how they integrate into their environment. Medicine is largely based off of this diagnostic and statistical manual, which is largely why mental health is getting worse and worse and worse. People aren't healing from mental health. They're just masking their symptoms and hoping that everything's going to get better. That's not how mental health works. There's been a huge demonization of mental health and disease in general, largely through the DSM, largely through the pharmaceutical industries with their marketing efforts. Of course, there needs to be a disease for a condition. If you want to learn more about this topic, I strongly urge you to go check out the blog post. We go more in depth in how it relates to the DSM, and we go over the major changes within the DSM itself to give you a greater understanding of the problems within the DSM. And don't forget, we're giving a book away, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, so make sure you subscribe, and if your subscribers are private, go follow me on Instagram and tell me that you subscribe to me on Instagram and give me a DM there. And we're going to give that away at 1,000 subscribers. I hope you enjoyed the video, hiked in for it. Nice waterfall here, a little local waterfall. Had a lot of fun shooting this one. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. Take care.